What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by Daniel Starkand. Daniel, we're here in Las Vegas, the Blue Wire Studios, the Wynn Hotel. The Dodgers are in first place. We're talking trades here in just a moment. It's a pretty good feeling right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be back here in Las Vegas. It's a little warmer than the last time we were here, but also the Dodgers are a little hotter right now, so I guess that kind of fits.
It's good. It's good. Well, hey, here's the deal. Today we're talking trades, and the trade deadline a few weeks away, August 2nd, and of course, we know there are going to be tons of rumors over that stretch. The Dodgers connected to anybody and everybody. This is a team that has historically been active. Manny Machado, Yu Darvish, among some of the guys, Max Scherzer, Trey Turner, they've gotten in recent years. And so the plan for today is we're going to throw out about 11 names of guys that you might hear about, and we'll say, are we interested, are we not interested? Maybe talk a little bit of cost as well. Let me frame the conversation, though, Daniel, with three questions, because I think we'll get into specific names in a minute. Let's talk position players to start. And the question I want to ask you is, do you trust the depth that the Dodgers have? When Chris Taylor is healthy, I think the starting nine is pretty much set. Mm-hmm. The issue last year was the Steven Souzas and the Billy McKinneys of the world. Do you trust the depth of this team, or do you think the Dodgers are going to need to go out and reinforce that part of the lineup?
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned last year, and I feel like that's kind of the problem the Dodgers ran into in the postseason. Like, if one or two guys get hurt, then bench guys are stepping into starting roles. Guys who shouldn't be on the roster are now on the roster, up in big spots late in games. So to me, even though like right now you look at guys like Trace Thompson, Jake Lamb, they're all performing pretty well. With that being said, though, I still think they should probably go out and get another bat or two, just because you never know. For depth purposes, you never know who could go down at what time. And I just really would like to avoid what happened last season, where it's like the season's on the line and Steven Souzas, at the plate with the bases loaded. So if I could avoid that at all costs by going out and getting, bench bats, I'm not saying going out and getting Juan Soto or anything, but if you could go out and get a bat or two, that could just be there for depth. I think, you might as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look, the first line of defense you mentioned, Trace Turner, Jake Lamb, Hanser Alberto, Edwin Rios when he's healthy, and then behind them, Zach McKinstry is around. Michael Busch is a guy who's tearing it up at the minor leagues. And so, again, we'll get into position players here in just a little bit, but I would say they're in a better spot than last year. You agree with that?
Yeah, that's definitely fair. Especially, I mean, with the recent addition of Trace, who's been great, and Jake Lamb, who's come up and been solid as well. I'd take those two guys over just about any bench bat they had last year.
And who knows? I mean, the Trace Thompson thing a month from now could look a lot different. But for now, it's looking good. Let's shift to the bullpen. And the question I want to ask you about the bullpen, again, before we get into specific names, is how many guys in that group do you currently trust come October? Now, I'll give you Blake Trinan, presumably going to be healthy. I imagine Evan Phillips is on that list. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Craig Kimbrell, Alex Vesia, Brusdar Graterol, Phil Bickford, Yency Almonte, maybe. Are any of those guys you trust in late inning situations besides Trinan and Phillips?
I think there's a difference between trusting them in late high leverage situations and just trusting them, overall, maybe in the fifth or sixth inning. So I definitely think the Dodgers have a bunch of quality arms. That they might be lacking that, probably one extra, high leverage guy, especially with the loss of Daniel Hudson. He was that guy. Yeah. So they really kind of need to find a replacement for him, in my opinion. Also, Brusdar Graterol goes down yesterday. I don't think that's anything too serious, but at the same time, it feels like guys in the bullpen have been kind of, been in and out of the lineup. So I definitely think if they could add, one more high leverage type guy, that would be beneficial.
Yeah, we're going to get into some names. That's a group I actually think should be the priority. But just looking through the guys they have, Trinan supposedly coming back. Daniel Hudson, you said, torn ACL, done for the year. Craig Kimbrell is Craig Kimbrell right now. Evan Phillips, awesome, 16 scoreless appearances. Vesia, Graterol, 3.30 ERA guys. They're fine. Sixth,
solid.
Seventh inning, you feel good there. Yency Almonte, ERA under 2. I think the jury is still out. David Price has been fine. Phil Bickford has been fine. There's a lot of guys that, again, you feel fine about, but not a lot of guys that you trust maybe at the end of the year. End of the game, excuse me. Okay, last one, starting rotation. And the question I want to ask you here is this. How sustainable is the success of the starting rotation? I'm thinking specifically about Tyler Anderson, Tony Gonsolin. Is their success sustainable? And even, I think it's worth including in here, Clayton Kershaw's health. Yeah. Are you willing to bet on this group, those three guys, sustaining success and staying healthy?
I feel like we've been asking this question for like 2 months now. Like, how long are they going to sustain it? And to this point, they've been able to. So you got to give them credit there. I'm not expecting Tony Gonsolin to go 22-0 with a 1.6 ERA this season, and I'm not expecting Tyler Anderson to necessarily win 20 games with a sub-3 ERA. But at the same time, I think those are two guys that at this point they've reached the status where we could trust them. They've started to give more length too, which is good. And then the Kershaw thing, obviously his health is a big question mark, but when he's been on the mound, he's been great. And Julio has also been great. So when you look at that, that's 4 really good starters right there. Like, they can, all 4 of them have a case to be on the All-Star team. You project that Walker Buehler is going to come back. Yeah. We don't know when. We don't know if he'll be healthy or not. Obviously, it's an arm injury, so you're always a little sketched out about that. But, if they get Walker Buehler back in September, that's obviously a huge boost. And then you look at a guy like Mitch White, who's been perfectly fine as an innings eater. He's actually been throwing the ball really well lately. You look, Dustin May could be back in August, September. So I feel out of the 3, position groups, I feel the starters are what I feel most comfortable with right now. I know there's been a lot of talk about should the Dodgers go out and get, another ace, a Luis Castillo, Frankie Montes, whatever the case may be. Me personally, I feel like, we just talked about the bullpen. We just talked about position player depth. I feel like those are bigger needs right now than starting pitching.
Yeah, I mean, just going through it, Gonsolin is just under 89 innings on the season. His career high in a season is 128. That was in 2018 between high A and double A. He threw 81 innings in 2019. He threw 46 innings in 2020 and 68 innings in 2021. So we're sort of in uncharted territory. Although the flip side, what I have long argued, the ERA has always been good. It hasn't been, 1.5 like it is now, but it's been good. The StatCast stuff, 93rd percentile in hard hit percentage, 87th percentile in a lot of the expected stuff. So I feel good about that. Tyler Anderson, durability, not an issue. He threw 167 innings last year, has thrown even more than that dating back to 2018. The question is success. And yet, again, I look at the StatCast, 91st percentile in exit velocity, 89th percentile in hard hit rate. So there's signs there that make me think that that's doable. Clayton Kershaw, already injured once, only 120 innings last year, 99 innings the year before that. Health, I think, is a real concern there. Julio is the guy I feel the best about because we've seen him do it. He's been successful for a number of times. 50% of his career innings, though, have come this year and last year. And yet, what I always have to remind myself, he's 25. Like, this guy's in the prime of his career. It's not a guy who's in his mid-30s. Then you mentioned some of the others' name. Andrew Heaney has already been on the IL twice.
I forgot about him,
but when he pitches,
honest,
he's got a .59 ERA in 15 innings. Dustin May due back in the next 4 to 6 weeks, it sounds like, touching triple digits. Mitch White has been great. Ryan Pepio looked good in his last start. Michael Grove has been okay. And then the sleeper of all that is Bobby Miller, the number 1 prospect, who knows what you get out of him. So starting pitching, I agree. And yet I'm going to throw out a couple names. One name in particular that I think is interesting, to say the least. Let me throw one more data point at you, and then we'll talk. The other key thing that we have to talk about when we talk about the trade deadline is the 40-man roster crunch that the Dodgers are facing. So right now, the Dodgers already have a number of prospects, Outman, Grove, Pepio, Vivas, Jackson, Amaya, Leonard, McKinstry, all of those guys already on the 40-man roster. And basically all of those guys, with the exception of, I would say, Pepio and McKinstry, are not contributing to the Dodgers this year. There's a number of guys now that need to be added next season. Cartaya, Pages, Vargas, Bush, and Ramos are all top 10 prospects within the organization that if you want to protect them from the Rule 5 draft, you have to add them. Now, what makes this tricky is you add those two lists together, and we're talking about 13 prospects on a 40-man roster where 26 guys are on the active roster. So you can't have your entire non-active roster guys be prospects, because a number of these guys, the ETA in the major leagues is 2023, 2024, that kind of a thing. And so there's 13 guys they need to do something. Mitch White, not included in that list, doesn't include Justin Brule, Clevenger, Eddie Alvarez, guys like that. And so the point of that is all to say a number of those guys are untouchable, but I think the Dodgers have motivation. They need to do something at the risk of possibly losing some of these guys for nothing. So they could, of course, make moves at the end of the season, in the middle of the offseason, but I just wonder if they try and package 4 or 5 of these guys in the type of deal that we're about to talk about. So let me turn to you. You did position players. I did relief and starting pitchers. So you've got 4 position players that you think could be in play, and we'll talk about what we think about those guys. So I'll let you start. Who do you have on your list?
Yeah, well, let me just start off by saying that if some of these names sound a little underwhelming, it's because I don't really feel like the Dodgers need like a superstar type bat to add to this lineup, and I also don't really think there's one out there. Like, obviously the dream is Juan Soto. Everyone would love Juan Soto. I don't think he's going anywhere. It would take the moon and the sea to get him.
All 13 of the guys that we just mentioned, I think.
And that might even get a no from the Nats. So with that being said, I do have a few guys here. The first guy is Brandon Drury of the Reds. He's having a career year. So I'd say out of these guys, he would probably be the highest prospect cost. But with that being said, I don't think you're giving up any of your top 3 or 4 guys in the farm system to get him. But he's having a career year. He's got 17 homers and an 853 OPS. And also, I think one thing we've seen with the Dodgers pretty much year after year is they kind of struggle against left-handed pitching. They brought in Hanser Alberto to kind of address that. He was supposed to be a guy that rakes against lefties. Hasn't really come to fruition yet. As much as we love Hanser, what he does in the dugout, we haven't really seen the production on the field. So Drury's kind of a guy that would take his place. He could play second base. He could play third base. He's got an OPS over 1,000 against lefties this year. Okay. It's also, it's an expiring contract. It's a 1-year, $900K. So it's basically no money involved. Yeah. It's a rental. So that, decreases the prospect cost as well. So he would be the first name on my list. And he's a guy who you could kind of plug in, in the 5 or 6 hole in your lineup and get some actual production, which, as we've seen for a lot of the year, is what the Dodgers have kind of been lacking.
Yeah, it's fascinating because with any of these position players, you could look at their starting lineup and say, Drury, is he a better option right now than Max Muncy? Is he a better option than a guy like Cody Bellinger? Obviously, they play different positions. Like, the Dodgers have guys in the lineup who aren't producing. Right. But the problem is Justin Turner, who's been great lately, Max Muncy, who hasn't, Cody Bellinger, who's been whatever, Chris Taylor, if he comes. I mean, the thing is, those guys aren't going anywhere. So it's not like their starting position is up for grabs. And so I think that's what would be tricky almost with getting someone like Drury, because now you've got a guy who's sitting there who it's like he's actually the best, offensive second baseman or third baseman or whatever that we've gotten. So I personally, I wouldn't be pushing to make an offensive addition because I like, the 4 to 6 guys they have on the bench personally. But I think for all the reasons you just mentioned, Drury's intriguing. And look, if it costs you a couple prospects that you basically were going to lose in the offseason anyways, then why not? Okay, who are the other 3 guys you've got on your list?
Yeah, and also one thing about Drury is he doesn't play the outfield. And I think if you kind of look at the Dodgers roster, they kind of need outfielders. I know Trace has been great, but when you see Chris Taylor going down, Gavin Lux has been playing a lot more outfield now. We know how that is. So these other 2 guys are outfielders. So the first one is Whit Merrifield from the Royals. Obviously, anyone who has seen his stats this year, they're not pretty. With that being said, though, that's a kind of a nice little buy low opportunity. He's another guy who has historically, done really well against lefties. He's also a guy who's kind of coming on. He's got a 946 OPS in the month of July. Obviously, a very small sample, but kind of like Justin Turner. He's a guy who has a track record of being a good player. Got off to a really rough start, starting to figure it out. But the thing about Merrifield that would be really appealing to me is his contract. He signed an extension with the Royals a few years back where the AAV is $4 million.
Wow.
And he's got a club option for next year and then a mutual option for the year after that. So he would be a guy who could kind of come in. He could play second base. He could play all 3 outfield spots. You can move him around. He gives you that versatility. He's a speed guy, so you could put him anywhere in the lineup pretty much. And he's a guy who I'm not calling him a Trey Turner replacement per se, but we do need to start thinking about the possibility that Trey Turner is leaving after this year. And if that's the case, Whit's a guy who you would have for another year or 2 under club control. He wouldn't necessarily play shortstop, but he could fill in at other spots and kind of be like a very poor man's Trey Turner in a sense,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the Trey Turner point is a good one. And just thinking it through again, when I hear Merrifield, I'm like, who is he better than? Like, would I rather have him on the roster? I think your point about somebody that can play the outfield, Zach McKinstry is kind of the only other guy. Michael Busch maybe a little bit can play outfield. Jake Lamb, like technically can play outfield. Like they clearly don't trust him there, and so really, Trace Turner is your 4th outfielder, and he's really the only guy Trace Thompson, the only the bench outfielder they have that you trust defensively. And so I think it's fair that adding a guy who could provide some versatility there might make some sense.
Yeah, and also these aren't necessarily guys who you would come in and they'd pencil them in the lineup every single day. They'd be guys who can move around a little bit. In the lineup one day, out of the lineup one day. If there's an injury, they can fill in whatever. So it's just good to have that depth. So with that being said, the next guy is Anthony Santander from the Orioles. He's another outfielder. He's having the best year of his career. He's got 15 homers right now, so he provides you a little bit of pop. Could be a nice little bench bat. He's another guy who has, he's a righty, so he could play against lefties. And he's also got 2 more years of arbitration, so he's a guy who you'd have some control over. I don't think the prospect cost would be, too high. So that's just another outfield option that kind of in the same role as Trace Thompson. It would kind of be Trace Thompson insurance. Like if Trace Thompson doesn't keep up what he's doing, which I don't think it's unreasonable to say.
I wouldn't bet on him being a 300.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a guy who could come in and give you a little pop off the bench.
Okay. And do you have any other guys on your list? Or
I do have one more.
Okay, so give me the fourth one, then I'll ask you who.
The fourth one is actually internal options.
Okay.
So you mentioned Michael Busch, also Miguel Vargas. Both of those guys are absolutely mashing in the minors right now. You mentioned that they're going to have to be added to the 40-man roster. At the end of this season. So if you could get those guys to come in and give anywhere close to the production they were giving at AAA, those are also some of your top prospects. So it's good to give them a little taste of major league action, even if you call them up and they don't do well, so be it. You send them down, they don't make the the postseason roster or whatever. But I do think it's interesting that obviously neither of these guys play outfield; they're both infielders. But Miguel Vargas has started playing left field over the last couple of weeks. So that could be a little sign of maybe, something to come.
So if it was up to you, would you trade for one of those 3 guys you mentioned? Or would you prefer to just say, take your chances with not only the guys they currently have on the major league roster, but then Vargas and Busch is sort of your last line of defense?
To me, I'd say out of that group, I think Whit Merrifield is the one guy who's actually kind of appealing just because, first of all, the price to acquire Whit Merrifield is lower now than it has been in years. But he's a guy who's been in trade rumors every single year. Like the Royals are never good. He's usually been, their one good player. And I think he's a guy who is not a great player by any means, but he's a guy who could come in and do kind of whatever you need. He could fill in at multiple positions, and he's under club control for a couple years. So I think if the prospect cost is not too high, like if it's reasonable, he's the one guy I would be after. Like you mentioned with the 40-man roster crunch, like if you could take a couple of those guys who are not necessarily, your top 5 guys, like if you're not trading Vargas, Busch, Pepio, Bobby Miller, Cartaya, like those 5 guys, I'm not trading any of those 5 guys. But after that, and I'd say maybe Pages is added to that list as a 6th guy as well. But after that, you got some guys like an Andre Jackson who has major league experience, is at this point, I don't know what else he could really do in the minor leagues. I think he's just unfortunately in an organization where there's a ton of pitching depth, so he hasn't really gotten an opportunity. But if you could take like 2 or 3 of those guys and make a deal happen, I'd be all for it. But with that being said, I would also be totally fine with what they have and the minor league depth with what I just mentioned with Vargas and Busch. Like, why not give them a chance if you need,
Yeah, I think we're in alignment. We feel good now. We would both probably agree that in addition to the Taylor injury, if there was one more injury, then we're probably on real thin ice.
Yeah,
and so if something happens in the next 3 or 4 weeks, that's why we're having this conversation. Those are some good names to mention. Let me talk some bullpen arms and throw some names at you. The first one is a name everybody's familiar with, and one that I don't even know if it's going to be movable or moved, but that's Josh Hader. We talk about him every single year on this show at the trade deadline. He has 1 more year of arbitration after this one. The question is whether the Brewers will be sellers. For the longest time, it seemed like the answer was going to be yes. Then they won a bunch of games. They're currently in first place as we record this. And so my gut tells me that Josh Hader stays in Milwaukee. They would look foolish trading him with 1 more year of team control in the middle of a race. 4 more relief pitcher names to mention. Joe Mantiply from the Diamondbacks. Would the Diamondbacks trade within the division? I don't know, but he's under team control until 2027. His ERA is around 1. He's striking out more than a batter an inning. A walk rate, he is walking .28 batters per 9 innings.
Wow.
That's his walk rate, which those are the metrics I look at for the Dodgers because those are the types of things they value, guys that throw strikes and aren't walking players. He seems to fit the mold the Dodgers like. Again, the question there is, would they trade within the division? David Robertson, a name that you're going to hear a lot about for the Cubs. He's got currently a sub-2 ERA in 32 innings, 12.25 strikeouts per 9 innings. The Baseball Savant StatCast numbers are all encouraging, and the Cubs will be sellers. He's 37 years old. He's been through some wars. He's real cheap as far as financial cost. I don't think this costs you one of the top prospects, but I think he's one of the better names there. 2 more. Michael Fulmer, sort of a random name. The StatCast stuff I like. 96th percentile in expected batting average, ERA, and slugging percentage, and barrel rate. 88th percentile in hard hit rate. The downside, he doesn't fit the Dodgers mold. Not a great strikeout rate, not a great walk rate either, but 2.1 ERA, probably a little cheaper than Robertson. The last name, probably the best guy on this list outside of Hader, is David Bednar from the Pirates. Probably the best guy on this list, but he's under team control through 2026. So again, would the Pirates trade him? I saw like an editorial from the Pirates saying like they've got to keep this guy, blah, blah, blah. So of those names, I would say that the bullpen to me is the biggest priority. And if we are going to add bullpen, I don't want another guy that I trust in the 7th inning. I want a guy that I trust in the 8th or the 9th inning. On that list, I think Robertson fits the bill. I think Hader or Bednar, if either are available, fit the bill. Do any of those guys jump out at you?
Yeah, I mean, David Bednar definitely jumps out. And I don't know if you remember, I suggested him as a trade target last year and on Twitter, and that somehow made its way to Pirates Twitter, and they were not happy with me for suggesting that. They're sold on him being their closer whenever they compete. They thought that would be now or next year. I tried to tell them, you guys aren't competing for another 4 or 5 years, so having an all-star closer isn't going to do a whole lot for you.
Yeah.
To me, if I was the Pirates, I'd look to deal him, because when is his value ever going to be higher? You mentioned how many years of club control. He's having, the best season of his career. But to me, that's also like that would be a pretty significant return coming from the Dodgers. So I think if you look at some of the other guys you mentioned, like a Robertson, who is just a rental, you mentioned, he's had a long path to get back to this point. So it's not like you're going to be giving up your top prospects for a guy like that. So I think if you could get a guy like him and hold on to all your top guys, I think that would be preferable, just because with relievers, they're so volatile. I think if you could get a rental for cheaper, that makes more sense than a guy who has a lot of years of club control, who they look great now, but who, an injury happens 2 years down the road, who knows what they're going to be. So I like the rental options personally for relievers. And I also think if you look at the Dodgers' past trade history, I think, they like that as well.
And I would even say get 2 of these guys. Like, I don't think I don't think there's enough guys on the roster right now that make me say we only have room for 1. I would go get 2 if I could. And keep in mind, you look at the future of the Dodgers bullpen. We keep talking about how Gratterall is going to be the closer of the future. He has not become that yet. Trinan is having arm issues. He did extend his contract. I don't know how long you'd bet on him. Kimbrel, we all know where that stands. Evan Phillips, the first time we're doing it. And so a guy like Bednar, yes, it would be a crazy cost for a closer, and yet the Dodgers don't have a closer in the system, it doesn't appear, for the next few years. Okay, 2 more names to throw at you. Let's move to the starting pitching side. I'm not even going to mention Frankie Montas. He's a name that comes up a bunch, but there's an injury question mark, and there might be some clarity on it, but I just think there's a little mystery around him, and so I'm leaving him out, at least for now. I'm sure we'll talk about him in the next few weeks. Luis Castillo is the first name. Again, nobody's going to be surprised to hear me say Luis Castillo's name. I will say the StatCast fairly pedestrian this year. He's sort of in the 50th to 60th percentile in a lot of categories. He was just above average last year, 70 to 80th percentile, but 3.09 ERA, did throw 190 innings each of the last 2 full seasons. So that's encouraging. He's a free agent in 2024. I do think if we're talking Luis Castillo, we're getting into Ryan Pepio or Michael Grove plus some things range. Here's the next name. This is the name that's most intriguing to me as I did my research. I looked at who might be available, what the cost might be. Pablo Lopez of the Marlins. Now, here's why it's interesting. He's just 26. He has a track record of success the last 2 years. The expected ERA has been 3.5 or below. He's signed through 2024, so you've got a few years of team control. The question is Lopez good enough to move the needle? From The Athletic, I was reading, they said, the Marlins need to find a 2-way center fielder, a left-handed middle-of-the-order impact bat, and simply better position players. Their major league team is loaded with quality arms. Their farm system has several top pitching prospects en route to the big leagues. However, given their market and their ownership, they can only do so much via free agency, which basically leaves the draft and trades to get what they need. Therefore, trading pitching at the deadline to improve their lineup and defense is probably their best path to contention. So the Marlins, interestingly, would be trading and trying to compete. I look at that sentence and I say, Michael Busch sounds like a perfect match for a team like the Marlins. James Outman isn't going to be like an all-star center fielder, but if you're looking for a guy who can play defense, that's the one skill we know will translate from Outman. And then could you move Busch, Outman, and then maybe one other guy, and maybe it's a Mitch White type, or maybe they say we want a Michael Grove type or something like that to go get Pablo Lopez. I think that would be interesting. So we've talked about Castillo. I'm curious if Pablo Lopez moves the needle at all for you.
I wouldn't say he's a needle mover. I think he's a pretty good pitcher, and I think if the price is reasonable, I think it's something worth inquiring about. But I don't know if I'd be willing to throw Busch in there. I think he's a guy who projects to be a starter or a major league guy as soon as next year. So I just for me, I think the price for starting pitching is just going to be too high. Yeah. I think if you look around the league, we're talking about the Dodgers potentially getting a starter. Yeah. Well, if the Dodgers need starting pitching, then that means 29 other teams also need starting pitching because the Dodgers have had the best rotation in the league. So everyone's looking for starting pitching, and I think you keep hearing the same names pop up. Like you always hear Frankie Montes, you always hear Castillo. You mentioned Pablo Lopez. He's another guy. But outside of that, I don't know. I don't think there's a whole lot of starting pitcher out there to be had. So I don't necessarily think it makes sense to get in a bidding war for a starting pitcher who, if we're being realistic, what would Pablo Lopez be like the Dodgers like fourth or maybe even fifth starter? So unless you could go get a guy who's going to be a huge impact in a postseason series, then to me it's just not really worth it. I think I'd rather just address the other needs.
Fair. So I think we both agree that the bullpen is probably the priority.
Definitely.
And then from there, not a huge need on the starting pitching side, maybe a need on a bench bat, depending on how health plays out. So let us know what you guys think in the comments below. Any of these names jump out at you? Where do you see the needs and the priorities for the Dodgers moving forward? My name's Jeff. This is Daniel. Again, thanks for watching and joining us here at DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. Make sure to subscribe, ring the notification bell, and check out Dodger Blue 1958 everywhere on social media. We appreciate you. We'll see you next time.